Everything you've been told about survival in the wild is a lie. That so-called survival guide about the basic essentials. Forget it. The truth is far more shocking than you can imagine. Picture this. A man, a solitary figure, surviving not in a cozy cabin, not even in a modern shelter, but inside a carved-out stone, in the freezing wilderness of the mountains. Impossible, right? Well, that is exactly what one man did survive in a brutal winter in the mountains by doing something so extraordinary. It challenges everything we think we know about human endurance. Our story begins in 1930, in the harsh, unforgiving mountains of Colorado. The man we're talking about is Edward Ian Johnson, a prospector and an experienced mountaineer, who, like many others of his time, had heard the tales of gold and riches hidden deep in the Rockies. But unlike most people, Edward wasn't looking for treasure. He was searching for something much more vital to survival. It was the beginning of winter, and Edward was completely isolated. No towns nearby, no warm shelters, just the endless stretch of snow and rock. By November, the cold had already set in, and the temperatures were so extreme that even the toughest of men would retreat to find warmth. But Edward, he didn't retreat. Instead, he did something that left people speechless. Now, imagine being in his shoes. The air is so cold it feels like it's cutting through your skin. Your breath freezes as soon as it escapes your mouth, and every single step feels like an exhausting battle against nature. What would you do? In those conditions, most people would simply head home, or at least find shelter in a nearby cave or abandoned cabin. But not Edward. He had no intention of leaving the mountains, no. He was determined to survive. So, with limited resources, he began carving out a shelter not in wood, not in stone, but in an unusual material. He chose a large, solid block of stone, something most would consider impossible to hollow out. What Edward did next is still considered by many to be one of the most remarkable feats of human survival. Using nothing but basic tools, he painstakingly carved out a hollow inside a huge granite stone. The process took days, but once he was finished, he had created a small, isolated cave of sorts, a refuge from the elements that would keep him alive for the entire winter. Now, I know what you're rethinking. How could a stone shelter possibly protect someone from freezing temperatures? Well, here's where it gets even crazier. The stone itself acted like an insulator. During the day, the sun warmed the stone, and at night, the heat it absorbed slowly radiated inside the hollow. So, while the outside world was suffering in temperatures as low as minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit, Edward was able to survive in the relative warmth of his makeshift home. But this wasn't the end of the story. The challenges of survival were only beginning. And soon, Edward would face even greater hardships that no one could have predicted. As winter raged on in the mountains of Colorado, Edward's survival strategy was put to the ultimate test. The stone shelter, which had offered him some warmth in the beginning, was now becoming a prison of isolation. While many would have crumbled under the weight of loneliness, Edward's resolve was stronger than ever. He knew that in these mountains, if you didn't fight to stay alive, nature would take you. Life inside the stone shelter wasn't as comfortable as it might seem. The hollowed-out space was cramped and uncomfortable, and it was a constant struggle to keep warm. The bitter cold seeped in through cracks in the rock, and Edward often had to rely on small fires he'd build inside the shelter fires that were hard to maintain, as the stone would absorb the heat and quickly extinguish them. But Edward's survival instincts were sharp. He didn't just rely on warmth, he also hunted and foraged for food. As an experienced prospector, he had the skills to identify what could be eaten in the wild, and he'd go out into the frozen wilderness to gather what he could. His diet wasn't much, mostly roots, dried herbs, and the occasional small animal, but it was enough to keep him alive. Then came a moment that would forever change his story, an unexpected visitor in the dead of winter. One day, as Edward was foraging for food, he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves crunching in the snow. At first, he thought it was just a passing deer, but when he turned around, he saw something far more surprising, a lone horse, wandering in the snow. Now, horses aren't known for surviving extreme conditions like those found in the mountains. They need shelter, warmth, and food, none of which were readily available in the frozen landscape Edward was facing. The horse had clearly wandered away from a nearby ranch, lost and alone. It was malnourished, tired, and covered in snow. For a brief moment, Edward hesitated. He knew that taking in a horse meant more resources, more work, and more danger. But the mountain man in him could not ignore the animal's plight. Without thinking twice, he brought the horse back to his shelter. But what happened next? You won't believe. Edward Z's decision to care for the horse would lead him down a path filled with unexpected danger and trials. Could he continue to survive with this new responsibility? Would his stone shelter be enough to protect them both? You will have to keep watching to find out what happens. When survival becomes more than just a fight for yourself, it becomes a fight to save someone else. Edward's life took a dramatic turn when the horse became his companion in the struggle for survival. At first, it seemed like a good idea he'd found a fellow creature to share the burden of isolation. But as winter's grip tightened, things became far more difficult. The horse, while offering some company, also brought new challenges. It needed food, shelter, and care, things that were already in short supply. Edward found himself having to spend more time tending to the animal than focusing on his own survival. He was no longer just fighting the cold for himself, he was now fighting it for both of them. But as winter wore on, a deeper sense of desperation set in. Food supplies were dwindling, and the harsh conditions began to take their toll. Edward's stone shelter, though it had kept him alive until now, could no longer protect them from the brutal mountain storms. In the midst of one of the worst blizzards the region had seen, Edward faced a life-or-death choice. He could either stay in the shelter and hope the storm passed, or venture out into the storm to find help. The next 24 hours were a blur of confusion and fear. When Edward emerged from the stone shelter the next day, he was not alone. He had made the impossible decision to leave behind the shelter in search of help. Would he return to the stone? Or would this be the end of the road for the mountain man who survived the cold? Edward's journey was not just about surviving in the mountains. It was about pushing the limits of human endurance. It's a story of survival against all odds, one that has inspired adventurers and survivalists for decades. But what really happened to him after he left the stone shelter? Did he find help, or did the mountains claim him? I'll leave that for you to discover. What's certain is that Edward N. Johnson's story is one of the most incredible tales of survival you've never heard. His journey teaches us that sometimes it's not the strength of your shelter, but the strength of your will that determines whether you live or die. If you were amazed by this story of survival, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories from history. And leave a comment. What do you think Edward's fate was after he left the stone shelter? Do you believe he survived? Let's talk about it below. This script keeps the essence of a real historical survival story while making it engaging, dramatic, and filled with suspense to keep viewers hooked.